Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Todd O'Hara. I'm the Senior Government Affairs Manager for Cloud Peak Energy. We are about the fourth largest coal mining company in the United States, and we own and operate the largest coal company in the state of Montana. I'm also on the board of directors for the Montana Chamber of Commerce, and it's a role that I've enjoyed and relished over the last few years, and I'm happy to be here acting on behalf of the Chamber as a moderator of this panel. Before we get started, I think it's important that we acknowledge our sponsors here for the business days that make this entire event possible. So let me just start out with Associated Employers, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Montana, Boeing, Charter Communications, Cloud Peak Energy, EBMS, First Interstate Bank System, Montana State Fund, Northwestern Energy, Pacific Source Health Plans, and Town Pump. So let's all give those a hand and appreciation for their support here today. So in the interest of time, as we keep rolling around here, we have a hard stop at 4:45 here. We want to make sure we leave enough time at the end of this panel discussion for a good question and answer sort of a session. I think you're going to enjoy this. I'm going to skip the introductions of the individuals that are speaking here today. You've got that in your packet. And we're going to start on my immediate left here with Dr. Pat Barkey of the University of Montana. We're just going to work our way down the table towards the very end. We'll save questions to the very end. Appreciate your interest in this thing, whether you are directly involved with supplying coal or goods and services to the natural or to the coal-fired generating facilities, or whether you are a consumer of electricity. This has got to be one of the largest issues facing the state of Montana today. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Barkey for his presentation.
Thanks. Good afternoon. After hearing about economists all afternoon, I figured it's about time you saw a genuine article here. I'm keeping my horns down, and I do have two hands. It's my privilege to give this presentation. I'm going to do something a little different than I normally do, and I'm going to give my conclusions first. Conclusion number one, the coal strip generating plant is an incredibly important piece of the economy. You actually didn't need to read the study that we just did to learn that. We did a study in 2010 that showed the outsized importance of that relatively small parcel of land in southeast Montana. Two other conclusions I'd like to state, and these are really the bottom line of what I'm going to talk about. The second one is perhaps not quite as obvious, but is well known by many in this room, and that is the coal strip generating plant is an incredibly important part of our electricity infrastructure. Incredibly important. As a matter of fact, it's hard to know how important it is because it's been around so long and it's been so reliable for so long. But its loss puts the system to a very tough test, and one in which extraordinary investments have to be made in a very short period of time to give us the things that we're all used to having. The third conclusion I'd like to say is that high electricity prices are bad for the economy. High electricity prices propagate everywhere. No one escapes them. Every kind of business uses electricity, has for a long, long time. And when they go up, and if they go up a lot, then economic choices are made, and those are rarely good ones for the outcomes that we care about for the economy. So those are the conclusions. Let me talk a little bit about the study. We did a study of the Clean Power Plan's final rule, which came out in August. It is a rule which was a surprise, a negative surprise, which put the percentage reduction, depending on exactly how you measure it, but put the percentage reduction in CO2 emissions from fossil fuel power plants in the state of Montana on a percent basis higher than any state in the country. We are a state which doesn't have a lot of easy choices as a result. We're 95% coal in terms of our fossil fuel fleet, and really that's what this reg is about. So no matter what anyone else says, it is pointed directly at coal-fired electric generation, particularly here in Montana, because that's mostly what we've got. So we did a study for Northwestern Energy and the Montana Chamber to take a look at a what-if scenario. So from a very narrow point of view, I'm going to describe the consequences of an event which could happen. It's not a forecast of something that's going to happen, but I think, as I'll say in a minute, it's a pretty relevant one. We used a model to analyze the future for the economy in a world of compliance with what we call 111D, which is a portion of the Clean Air Act, which is argued to give EPA authority to make this kind of regulation. And so we're looking at the difference between two futures, and that's what I'm going to describe quantitatively. The future of a status quo as we are today, sailing into the future, versus one where we have to make changes in order to comply with the regulation. What kind of changes would those be? We really don't know. Clearly things have moved along since we released the study in mid-November. The advisory board's been formed. People are thinking very hard about this because they have to, because everything's coming up quick. So the requirement to file a plan is coming up quick. The compliance plan is coming up very quickly. And so we're going to take a look at the, it's kind of a trick looking at my own slides here. We don't know what the compliance plan is going to be, a lot of missing details, but as I said, its target really is the fact that we're 95% in terms of our fossil fuel coal, and we have to reduce CO2. That's what's really going to be impacted. And particularly coal strip, because coal strip is the single biggest emitter of CO2 in our electricity generation. And so that's going to be, I'll just say, challenged. And so what I'm doing is I'm working out the implications in this study for Northwestern and the Chamber of what that all means for the economy. Because that's my expertise is the economy. I look over here to this Northwestern table and I watch for frowns because they know that's their business, is keeping the lights on, certainly for a good portion of our state. But I know a lot about the economy, so we're going to be sort of marrying those two together to try to understand. So I want to emphasize that this study may be flawed. You may not like it. You may have wished I did some other study, all right? But what this study does is it tries to analyze a complete set of steps which are consistent with making our electric grid whole and complying with 111D. So partial studies, as in maybe we should build this, maybe we should build that, are fine, different studies, but to be comparable with this, they have to work through all the implications. So they have to replace what is lost to Montana in particular, and also comply with the reg. So this graph here is a matter of arithmetic. This is not a choice that made, but this informs the kind of choice we're looking at. This is an attempt to quantify what the required reduction in CO2 from fossil fuel generating facilities in Montana, what that is as an order of magnitude, all right? So the bars starting at the top, the bars at the top are the annual CO2 emissions of different combinations of coal-fired electric generation. So the first is Unit 1, of course, Colstrip has 4 units. Unit 1 by itself, Unit 1 plus 2. The third one is Unit 1, 2, and then half of 3. And then the lowest bar is 1, 2, and 3. And those are based on the historical emissions of Colstrip over the last 20 years. The red line is the required reduction in CO2 emissions. So, by the way, there are asterisks and footnotes on a lot of this. That red line happens to be calculated a little bit differently than the EPA did. It's calculated using a longer period as a baseline for CO2 emissions targets to compute the required reductions against. But without getting into the weeds too much, this just gives you an idea. These aren't choices. These are just arithmetic. So you look at the reduction, which if I read that right is a little over 8 million tons. You can see that units 1 and 2 and half of 3 just about do it. By the way, the lowest bar is every other coal-fired generating unit that's currently operating in Montana today. So there's different combinations of actions. There's other actions other than the ones on this page. I won't go into all those, but just as numerically speaking, you can see the order of magnitude. So the first thing you see is closing units 1 and 2 by itself doesn't do it. It's not enough. There has to be more than that. Lots of options exist. And one in particular that's mentioned is closing 1, 2, and half of 3. That gets you there, as you can see. For a lot of reasons, it is argued, and arguable and reasonable to argue, I would conjecture, that operating Colstrip in a manner where only part of it were working half of it or more than half of it were shut down, would no longer be economic, because it would cause all of the fixed costs of that facility to be borne by a much smaller revenue stream. And so really, if you're talking about closing partial, arithmetic exercises like this, in the real world of making business decisions, may not work. And for that reason, we looked at a compliance scenario in which all of Colstrip were shut down in order to comply with 111D. There's consequences that flow from that. Clearly, there's economic consequences, but there's also consequences for the electric grid. One consequence which surprised that shouldn't surprise people, is that if Colstrip is gone, then the adjacent coal mine is no longer viable. I mean, it's a mine mouth plant delivered by conveyor and there's a few small customers besides Colstrip to the Western Energy Mine, but by and large, that mine would suffer a fatal blow if Colstrip were to go. What surprises people is that the 500 kV line, which runs west across the state towards the Northwest states for the owners of the plant to serve Pacific Northwest cities, that also suffers a fatal blow for a variety of reasons. One is simply physical, in that without the large push of electrons from a 2,300 megawatt generating station, there's simply not enough to fill the pipe to make that kind of line with that kind of capacity a viable part of the grid. There's also legal reasons dealing with what's going on with BPA in terms of the contractual arrangements, BPA's investment in that, which is contingent on operating Colstrip, and that could be undone. A second thing that comes about, and this is because of the way we chose to go about studying this, is okay, we've just lost 2,300, give or take, megawatts of generation. What's that going to do to the Montana grid? Well, one thing that it does is it really unbalances the transmission system. But first, before I talk about that, talk a little bit about generation. Looking at on the northwestern side, looking at energy transmission and generation minus Colstrip is not acceptable in terms of its reliability for Montana customers. Something has to be done. What will be done? Lots of things could be done. But in terms of understanding how that impacts the economy, we put in some specific things. Other things could be done, but there's sort of this kind of investment. So the kind of investment would be something like a 250 megawatt combined cycle combustion turbine, probably somewhere near Billings, would make sense as a place to put it. It would require also some additional transmission capacity to balance the system with Colstrip being gone. So that's the new 230 kV line you can see there that goes roughly between Three Forks and Great Falls. You also have to add infrastructure to serve this combined cycle combustion turbine facility and buildings. We don't have that kind of facility. We don't have that kind of extra capacity in the natural gas system. So why does this all matter? Well, it matters because we need to keep our system whole. We need to keep reliability there. We need to be able to serve all the customers across Montana, both Northwestern as a company and, of course, as policymakers, we need to make sure that happens as well. The third thing that happens in this compliance scenario is we recognize two things. First off, that this is not just happening in Montana. It's happening nationwide. Nationwide, there's incredible pressure on CO2 generating facilities to be retired early and to be replaced in some fashion with what could potentially be higher cost power. That will affect the price on wholesale electricity markets. By how much? Studies indicate it could be significant. It could be on the order of 10% easily, 10 to 15%. There's an additional Montana effect, however, and that is the net effect of compliance, as we're describing it in the study, is that Montana goes from being a net exporter of electricity, a significant net exporter of electricity, to a state which must occasionally import, even in the scenario I'm describing with the additional turbine, to one that has to occasionally import power. Now that is such a break from the status quo that it's hard to really appreciate what that means. But let me give you an example. There are choice customers, industrial and large commercial customers throughout Montana that since DREG have the ability to purchase their power on the wholesale market. They don't need to get their power served by MDU or Northwestern or whoever. They can contract with a merchant provider in a different state or any place else to get their power. But what really happens to their power is that when it comes time to have their power, I'll pick on Benefice for a second in Great Falls. What really happens when they get their power delivered is that there is a recognition of the fact that they can, and no matter who they contractually get their power from, be it BC Hydro or anybody like that, when they actually get their power delivered, there's a swap that often takes place, and usually takes place, so that their power actually comes from Colstrip, even if they didn't buy it from Colstrip. And of course, in doing that, they get a discount because it doesn't have to travel very far. All right, now, that's the way it's worked for decades. These large customers may not be aware of it. In fact, when I talked to some of them weren't even thinking about this. But that discount is going to be replaced by a premium. Because with no Colstrip and with no excess right there in our backyard to sell to large customers in Montana, they now have to actually get their power from several states away. And guess what? We're a long ways away from those other point sources of generation. So that's getting into the weeds a little bit. We already know that the closure of units 1 and 4 is a big deal from the study we did in 2010. By the way, I went over that very quickly, but it shows up in the study. It dominates the study. There's also some other things to be fixed up. If Colstrip is actually closed, we have to remediate the site. That costs money. We have this asset that has to be somehow charged off the books. How much of that is borne by ratepayers is a decision to be made. We have the property tax payments of that particular facility. Those go away. The site is turned into a field, and the property tax revenues go away. Furthermore, you have the transmission line. Then you have the coal mine. The coal mine, of course, coal mines, as Todd well knows, and I don't know if you put it exactly this way, but coal mining is high-octane fuel for government revenues. There's special tax treatment that contributes in a lot of ways that are over and above other kinds of economic activity. And then you have the property tax on the 500 kV line. So I'm sort of spitting these things out because you want me to go, right? But there are big price tags. I mean, this is adding up to a pretty big change. So there's other price tags. Go over these quickly. You have the price of building all the new stuff. But by the way, that also helps the economy. I mean, you're building things that is creating jobs and construction and operation of these new facilities. But it's really an apples and oranges kind of thing. I put up a slide there very quickly. Said 370 talent employees at Colstrip. There's also a lot of contractors there. You know how many employees that we could expect at a 250 megawatt combined cycle combustion turbine generating facility? It doesn't exist in Montana. There aren't any to look at. But there's plenty across the country. So 370 Colstrip jobs, not counting contractors. 14 jobs. All right? So that's the nature of that kind of business. It doesn't have a lot of material handling jobs and so forth. It's a whole different process, delivery by pipeline, et cetera. So it's really quite a swing. Talking about in terms of how things turned out. So combining these two futures, you look at what it does to the economy, and this is kind of the bottom line slide. This is a difference between what the economy would have looked like without compliance, as I've described, and compliance with the actions taken to both comply with the regulation and keep the system whole. And they're pretty significant. You're talking about, depending on exactly what year you look at, over 7,000 jobs in 2025. You're looking at $500 million of personal income. That's the sum of all income received by Montana households. It's $500 million less per year. All right. Why is that? Well, there's less jobs, and those jobs are high-paying jobs. Tax revenues are especially targeted. You have all of the activities I described, plus all the impacts of higher electricity prices being pushed along to high energy, everything. We don't have an aluminum plant here anymore, and part of that's because of electricity, all right? But you have everything from fertilizer to, server farms, if they ever were to come here, anything that uses electricity especially is going to look at Montana in a different light because we're special. We have a 47% reduction required. Output population, you have people who will move away from Montana because of job opportunity, or maybe they would have moved here, but now they don't. Couple more things about some of these outcomes. This is a graph. It's rather hard to read from your table, I suspect. I'll tell you what it is. It's a look at the job impacts by 5 different regions of the state of Montana. So I have 5 different regions, and I have a bunch of time. So the first thing you see is one of those lines has fallen a lot lower than the rest, and that's eastern Montana. That's Rosebud County. That's where ground zero for this. You notice these results do change a little bit over time. But you notice that all those other 4 lines, if you look closely, and if you can read the numbers, which is a little tough, but the report's on our website, montanacleanpowerplanstudy.org. If you look at all those, they're pretty significant. Northwestern Montana, almost over 1,000 jobs lost in northwestern Montana. And that's because of the property tax implications, the spreading of coal revenues across the state. It's because of higher electricity prices. It's because of things like transport of coal, MRL is in northwestern Montana, et cetera. So that's some important stuff. The jobs are all over. So if you look at the job losses in 25, yeah, utilities and mining are taking a hit, no question about it. But the 2 biggest wedges here are construction and state and local government. All right? Construction is because with the economy taking this kind of hit, all of the building plans, all the businesses that were thinking about expanding are going to put off that expansion. They'll eventually grow again. This is not going to kill growth forever, nothing like it. But it's going to have a serious hit for businesses like construction that depend on growth. And government is really from that tax revenue impact. Property tax effects, income tax, all the effects. And really what's really amazing is, and disturbing, quite frankly, is when you look at the kinds of jobs that are lost. 7,100 jobs is a pretty big number, I would argue. Some people don't think that's a big number, but I think it is. The average pay of those jobs in 25 is, what is it, $65,000? I can't read it. Yeah, 65.7. That's a little more than double the average pay of a Montana job. So this is it's going to hurt jobs, and it's going to hurt the wrong kinds of jobs for those of us who care about trying to grow the kinds of high-wage jobs that'll help keep our kids in Montana and help support the community in the way that only the economy ultimately can. Let me talk a little bit about, just a second, I'm almost done here, what's going on in eastern Montana. So I didn't show percentages, but I want to show these for eastern Montana, because eastern Montana is really is going to suffer a significant blow. You can see that job change is a big number, but in percentage terms, it's 7% of all jobs in eastern Montana. So that's a future that is considerably less bright, and clearly that gets worse and worse the closer you get to downtown Colstrip, Montana. In terms of output, what's meant by that is gross sales by businesses. So businesses in eastern Montana will see a 10% decline in their sales. That's the entire region. So I think that's statewide, the percentages are a little lower, but I think that's pretty significant. So just a couple things to sum up. I'm sitting next to Todd, so I guess I have a right to be pessimistic, right? Since you were kind of the light of optimism in one of the previous sessions. It's a big job hit. It's a big business hit. It's something that I think when you ultimately look at how it turns out, you're looking at a decline that is, really easily the biggest setback to the state economy. If and this is a what if, the biggest setback to the state economy for at least 3 decades. I'll give you an idea of the order of magnitude of what these numbers mean. $500 million of personal income decline. All right, that's about half of what happened in the Great Recession statewide. All right, so not as bad as the Great Recession, but you can apples and oranges clearly, but just as an order of magnitude, that's the kind of number that comes out of this compliance with this reg. I think the impacts are pretty broad. They hit high-paying jobs, they hit eastern Montana, they hit a lot of industries, and they hit a lot of parts of the state. And it's hard to run and hide from the job losses in that pie chart, because there's really nobody winning from this in terms of the economy. So on that note, I will stop and give it back to Todd. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barkey. So I think you can see now, as Dr. Barkey has outlined why this issue was voted by the Montana Chamber of Commerce Board as the #1 issue for 2016. The impacts of this have the potential to be devastating to the Montana economy. So the Montana Chamber has taken this on as their #1 issue. Turning now to the regulatory front, we turn to Brad Johnson, who is the chairman of the Public Service Commission, the 5-member Public Service Commission. And Brad, we welcome you here, and please give us some of your thoughts regarding the 111D rule.
Todd, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank all of you for joining us as well. I do intend to be, as many folks who know me would tell you, uncharacteristically brief. The fact of the matter is, my old buddy Conrad Burns used to tell me that the worst way in the world to die is to be talked to death, so keep it brief. So I will endeavor to do that. I wish I could tell you that I was going to give you a more uplifting take on the subject at hand today, but after listening to Dr. Barkey, all I can say is, yeah, what he said. I believe, and I think there's a strong consensus on the part of the Commission, that there is, in all likelihood, no issue on the horizon today that poses a greater threat to the economic future of Montana than does implementation of the Clean Power Plan as it is currently written. My remarks today are based on extensive analysis that we have carried out in-house under the leadership of our director of the Public Policy Bureau at the Commission. Much of what many of the conclusions that they have reached in that analysis mirror what Dr. Barkey has said. I will tell you that it is the belief of myself and other commissioners that there is only one outcome to this entire issue debate that is going to be benign for Montana, and that is repeal of the rule. None of the scenarios that we have analyzed are without dramatic impact on this state's economy. And I will tell you that in our mind the question is not will there be dramatic impact, but how dramatic will that impact be. And I also want to tell you in terms of context here, we didn't start off on the fight here when for a year or longer we were being told repeatedly that the draft rule was in all likelihood going to mandate a reduction of emissions in the neighborhood of 21%. We looked at that, pushed as sharp a pencil as we could, said we don't particularly like that, but we probably can find ways to accommodate it. But then come last August, when we were blindsided by the final rule and an increase from 21 to 47%, frankly, we said that is just not something that we are going to realistically be able to accommodate. And I would also comment a little bit on the process. We commented extensively early on in the process to the EPA, expressing our concerns and opinions about what the rule should perhaps look like. As of yesterday at our meeting, the Commission has voted to no longer participate in that comment process. And I would summarize to you the reason for that. It is said that when he was contemplating signing the Emancipation Proclamation, that Abraham Lincoln brought his cabinet members into the cabinet room and polled them as to whether or not he should sign that document, and every one of his cabinet members advised him against it. He thanked them and said, "Gentlemen, the ayes have it," and signed the proclamation. That is the way we believe the EPA views its relationship with the Montana Public Service Commission and with the state of Montana. So there is very little point in us continuing to engage in dialogue with them. And we hear a good deal of talk about the flexibility that's being granted to the states as they seek to structure some kind of compliance plan. And I would say to you that under the scenarios that have been made available to us, that telling Montana we shouldn't worry about the nature of 111D because we as a state will have flexibility to implement it is not at all unlike the judge telling the condemned man he shouldn't worry about the death sentence because he'll be allowed to pick the method of execution. It is that dire, I believe, in terms of what we face as a state. Implementation of this plan will, in nearly all likelihood, result in dramatic increases in electricity prices. We have seen estimates as high as 30%. I'm not suggesting that that's set in stone by any stretch, but that gives you some idea as to how drastic that impact can be. And I would remind all of you here that when we look at a state that, based on the most recent numbers I've seen, has a per capita income of 49th out of 50 states, that when you start raising utility rates, especially on those who are at the lower tier of that income structure, that it is probably as regressive a government-mandated tax as you can consider. And so we ought to be very, very conscious about the impact we're going to have on those, especially in the lower income reaches of our economic system. There is no question in my mind, as Dr. Barkey pointed out, that implementation of the plan will also, at the very least, cripple, if not altogether kill, the coal industry in Montana. It will devastate at least one eastern Montana community that we come to know as Colstrip. But when you look at the broader impacts that Dr. Barkey has laid out with regard to the economy of eastern Montana, our once thriving rural communities in eastern Montana are on the ropes as it is. And this represents just yet another nail in the coffin of that part of our culture. It is my hope that we will see some success in the court system. Montana has joined 26 other states in suing the EPA with the belief that, in fact, there is indeed extra-constitutional overreach through this executive rulemaking process. And as I said, we believe that repeal is really the only thing that will be okay for Montana, but we're looking at a slow and torturous process as we move through the courts. In all likelihood, not seeing a resolution at the Supreme Court level perhaps until 2018, and that is problematic in that we are looking at, as we speak, a 2016 deadline for submission of plan, or at that point an extension of 2 years to 2018. So we're going to be right up against the deadline by the time we have some kind of indication from the courts in terms of where we're going to be. I think it's important to reinforce what Dr. Barkey spoke to in terms of the importance of the coal industry in Montana. Some numbers somewhat different, but still bringing us to the same conclusion. We have developed this coal trust fund from the severance tax of nearly $1 billion. 2014 revenues just from severance tax into that fund of $57 million, in all likelihood gone. We see coal mining in Montana in terms of both direct and indirect employment and economic activity, employing in excess of 5,000 people, 5,000 of the best paying jobs in Montana, generating an annual payroll of $270 million. representing not only the loss of that direct economic activity, but also the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenues to state, county, and local municipalities. And so it is indeed a huge impact that we're looking at. And then when you look at the impact of closing down Colstrip, and again, I appreciate the observation that it's not as simple as saying we're only going to close down part of Colstrip. That may not be a viable alternative as we look at compliance plans. We may well be faced with, for all intents and purposes, an all or nothing situation there. And Colstrip represents, again, hundreds of millions of dollars of taxes to state and local government, a huge payroll and employment directly and indirectly of nearly 3,000 people. So it is not difficult to understand why we have such concern over the impacts of this. And then add to the equation the fact that it's not just the EPA that has Montana and its coal-fired electric generating units in the crosshairs. It's also our neighbors to the west, Oregon and Washington State. Both legislatures are actively considering legislation that in fact would create scenarios whereby the utilities in those states would acquire majority shares in the units at Colstrip where they have partial ownership now for the express purpose of closing those generating facilities, and would do so, frankly, at great public cost to the citizens of those states. So we've got that threat to contend with as well. I think that there is, frankly, a focus here that hasn't been discussed very broadly in terms of an alternative beyond the concept of fighting back in the courts. It would seem to me that a state like Montana ought to look at the tremendous potential we have in that trillion-plus tons of coal under our feet here, and say, rather than simply accepting an arbitrary decision to remove that tremendous energy resource from our portfolio, we ought to figure out a way that we can develop that to meet the needs as we look to the future. And I think that there is a very real reason here in Montana for us to be looking at trying to develop a very real focus on creating an initiative to encourage and perhaps, as I put it, make Montana the mecca of research and development for clean coal development. I think that the potential there is absolutely tremendous. And when we look at the energy needs, not only domestically, but internationally, it is unrealistic to think that we are going to continue to meet those at an adequate level without coal as a major part of the energy portfolio. And we need to, I think, come to grips with that, and add to that the threat that we create by this arbitrary elimination of coal from the energy portfolio to the reliability of the grid. And I want to make absolutely clear that I am in no way, shape, or form anti-renewable energy. That is not the issue here. But what is an issue here in the short term, as we say we're simply going to be rid of coal and the power that we generate with it, is how we're going to replace, in this case, some 2,100 megawatts of very reliable, affordable, and dispatchable power that we can control as it moves onto the grid at the levels that are needed to preserve that reliability. How are we going to replace that source of electricity with renewables that, frankly, are just, with today's technology, not dispatchable? a very real question to which there is today no real answer. And to be honest with you, I'm afraid I'm going to leave a lot more questions here than answers, but I do think it is incredibly important as we look forward that folks across this state have a clear understanding of the true impact of what is a warm and fuzzy sounding policy on the people of the state of Montana. And then I would leave you with this thought. Government, in my experience, is rarely good at cost-benefit analysis. And I can think of no instance where there's a greater example of that than what we're discussing here today. And again, I'm going to share data with you. In fact, it just came to me today. I had our analysts rerun the numbers because I wanted to be absolutely sure that what we were sharing with you here today is accurate. If, in fact, we move forward, I should back up. I asked the analysts to calculate two numbers. I asked them to calculate global CO2 levels in 2030 in two scenarios. If we implemented 111D, or the Clean Power Plan, 100% as it is written today, what would those global CO2 levels be? And then what would those same CO2 levels be globally if we did nothing and didn't incur the loss of tens of thousands of jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenues and the destruction of communities? What would the CO2 level be? What is that differential? And according to our best numbers, run and rerun, we're talking about subjecting the great state of Montana to all of this sacrifice in order to accomplish a 1% differential. Now, if anyone here can make the case that that is sound cost-benefit analysis, I'd sure love to hear from you, but I don't believe it is. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat this. This is not going to be an easy fight, but I would say it is important enough that maybe we ought to be a little philosophical about it. I'm a child of the 60s. I remember very clearly John Kennedy announcing that America was going to send a man to the moon and return him safely to the earth before the end of that decade. And he went on to say that we choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And I think it is falling to us today to commit to do the hard things if we're going to meet our responsibility to future generations of Montanans and to come together to, as effectively as we can, be part of an effort to keep this plan from being implemented on Montana. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, and thank you for being here on behalf of the Public Service Commission. So, Mr. Klemp, I guess it leaves the act of levity up to you to bring a little humor to this group. And I'd just preface this real briefly. Dave Klemp is he's an engineer, a graduate here of Montana Tech in Butte. He's been at Montana DEQ for about 23 years, and the job of coming up with a plan to comply with this 111D rule resides entirely in Dave Klemp's division. And so he has a monstrous charge in front of him. And so with that, Dave, no pressure, but what's the view of the Montana Department of Environmental Quality?
Well, thank you, Todd. I just one question. Is it too late for me to go first? But no, in all seriousness, thank you very much for having me here today. In all those years in air quality, I haven't ever spoken to the Chamber of Commerce, and I look back and I kind of wonder why, because there's a lot of things we've done that's impacted a lot of businesses in terms of implementing regulations throughout the years. And I'm going to start with hopefully a little bit of levity, but it's really on point here for what we're seeing with this Clean Power Plan. I had the benefit of seeing the final agenda here recently, and I'm on a panel with a doctor, and I'm on a panel with the chair of the Public Service Commission. And I'm also knowing that in this room there's going to be a lot of, no pun intended, powerful folks in the room, from legislators to business executives and some very smart people. And then I also saw that Governor Bullock is going to be giving the keynote address, and I thought, well, Governor Bullock might be in the audience for this. And I shared that with my wife, thinking, holy smokes, what did I sign up for? And I have an 11-year-old daughter who said, boy, Dad, it sure stinks to be you. And I have an 8-year-old daughter who said, don't worry, Dad, maybe you'll get to meet Sandra Bullock, and everything will be just fine. And in all seriousness, and so as I'm sitting here, and I'm glad you can laugh, because we have to keep our sense of humor a little bit at times, appropriately so. But I really want to strike the right tone here, and you know, much like my one daughter is very pessimistic and my other daughter is very optimistic, I am here today neither as a pessimist nor an optimist, you know, at this point for the Clean Power Plan. And I am very respectful about what you heard, because those may very well be. We don't know what the impacts are. That's what you heard from Dr. Barkey and Chairman Johnson. But I want to take a step back and give folks some information that hopefully you can take away and form your own opinion as to what this does and does not do. As you can imagine, as a regulatory agency that is in charge of this, we see folks that are very pessimistic about what this is and does. Also, we hear from folks who think this is a tremendous opportunity, and they're very optimistic, you know, about the future. And that's kind of how our draft plan, or excuse me, our white paper that we developed during the draft 111D rule was taken. But I'm glad we're off of that now. We don't have a white paper out for this, and I think one of the panelists already mentioned the final rule is very, very different from the draft rule. And so I want to provide a little bit of context for you all to consider. First off, I'm an air quality person, right? And this Clean Power Plan was developed under the Federal Clean Air Act, and I think it's very important that we keep that in mind as we move forward. Normally, the administrator, and this is EPA, develops the requirements, and then states under this particular section are tasked with determining how to comply with those requirements. And as states, we're very territorial, very independent. We don't want the federal government coming in and telling us what to do or how to do it. And I'm certain that 49 other states and several territories are in the same boat, you know, in that regard. So the second part, I think this is really important because it's going to factor into some of the compliance options, you know, that we have. These plan requirements under this particular section of the code typically applies to existing affected sources. And I want to differentiate in this talk between those affected versus those impacted. And affected is a nice regulatorily way of saying that's somebody or some entity that is subject to this regulation, not one that might feel effects or impacts from that regulation, you know, like we talked about before. It also typically only applies to existing units. All right, and this rule is a little different than some of the typical stuff. All right, so for this particular plan, and incidentally, I put the definition up there, I won't read it, but that's basically a fossil fuel fired plant that's been in existence as of a certain date. And Montana, at the time of this writing, had 9, and we now have 8. And I'll go through what the remaining 8 are. Now, this particular rule gives states options to consider. We can, if that's what the state chooses to do, apply some of the requirements to new sources. And there may be some benefits or some disadvantages to doing that. And it also requires us to consider the impacts of this regulation, all right, moving forward, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So these are the affected units, no big surprise, 4 in Colstrip, 5 elsewhere, and I've identified the current plant in Billings that's already been decommissioned. So when we talk compliance and compliance pathways, a lot of this stuff, I know it's boring, but a lot of this is process. A lot of this is planning and developing plans, and I don't say that to diminish the significance of it because the plans are very, very important. But the very first deadline in front of us is the September submittal requirements, and that is where some states are planning to submit a final plan. And our particular state, and if you've read the executive order from Governor Bullock, we've been directed to prepare a submittal, an initial submittal, and request an extension of time for 2 years out to 2018. Okay, so these are some of the ultimate plans. The first deadline is 2016 reporting, and then there's a 2018 deadline. We have a little bit of time. From an air quality perspective, this is more time than we typically get. However, from an overall energy perspective, I completely understand this is moving pretty quickly. Government speed of light, if you will. All right, so what is the initial submittal? And I think this is really important. And I didn't bring my glasses. I can't see that close. So this is where we have to identify what we're contemplating. Very much the final rule was premised on the idea that this is an overall system, that it envisions, I think, all of the states participating, working together, notwithstanding some of the comments you heard before. I mean, that's a real issue. But that's what it contemplates. And so it asks states to stand up and say, hey, what are you considering? Because what you decide as a state may impact another state. And so it asks states to raise their hand and say, this is what we've got under consideration. It is in no way a commitment. So what we put together for submittal, to the extent there's something put together in September to submit to EPA, it is not reflective of a commitment, but rather ideas or thoughts moving forward. The most important thing for the interim is seeking input from those that are impacted by the regulation. And I'm going to go into that rather extensively at the end of the presentation. And this is very, very new. This is not just the affected units who need to comply with this requirements. This is all of those folks that you heard about that might feel the impacts from that. We also have to give an indication on early action for some energy efficiency programs. Now, all of these things, the process that we're using for this, many of you know, if not all of you, and many of you in the room are on this, the governor has established an interim Clean Power Plan Advisory Council that's going to provide recommendations to DEQ on that submittal. That's going to be the process for submitting that. So I need context too. You know, when I talk plan in 2018, I don't like necessarily talking in abstract terms. And I apologize for those in the back of the room who may not be able to see this. But this is really what the final plan is. And so I hope it helps you think about how we as a state can populate the various portions, you know, of that requirement. The most important, the most consequential part that we've talked about here is Section 4, and that is the identification of the emission standard on the affected electric generating units. And that is, how are we placing the requirements on those units that need to comply, all right? And there are also some other issues that need to be, once we figure out what the compliance mechanism is, then we also look at, okay, reliability of grid, economic impacts on low-income, vulnerable communities, all stakeholders, those types of things. And so that's a very large reason why I'm right in the middle, because the impacts, the actual impacts, you know, from my perspective, can't be characterized until after we determine what some of the compliance options that are under consideration, you know, that will be under consideration by the state of Montana. And so that's essentially what our submittal ultimately may be. This is very consistent with other 111D plans that the state has put together. All right, so for everybody's benefit, these are the targets. This is what needs to be complied with. And also, if you look at that number on the top, the rate, the 1,305 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, I need to get this out there so we're talking proper terminology, apples to apples. In the base year of 2012, we were 2481 as a state from those affected units, pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. When you take 2481 and go down to 1305, that is where the 47% reduction comes from. From a mass perspective, if you look at 2012, I think we were just shy of 18 million tons. 18 million tons down to 11.3 million tons is roughly, I think it's 40-some% reduction. So what I am also seeing is folks are mixing metaphors, so to speak. And so I really want to focus on this is what the target is. And states have an option of choosing between a rate or a mass-based target. And there will be pros and cons of each one of those. And that is what we need to put in front of this advisory council as well. There's also, I should highlight the interim targets, and there is quite a bit of flexibility that that leads to a lot of complexity with this rule as well, because there are some options that we would need to consider. So these are some of the key decision points moving forward that we need to talk about as a plan. The first is, what are we going to do, rate or mass? Is it best to invest in a bunch of renewable? Is it best to look at a mass-based target? To the extent you choose, a state chooses a mass-based target, then you got to look at allowances and how you allocate those allowances. Some states, some entities prefer auctions, some prefer free allocation of allowances, and then how long are the allowances good for, and who gets them. All of these are decision points that need to be discussed, moving forward. State or regional participation. As I mentioned, this final rule, much more than the draft rule, contemplates a national approach, a national perspective, because the system, the basis for this, whether we agree with it or not, is that it's basically one system, or a combination of three systems across the United States. And so the targets were established that way, and it's really important we not only understand what the targets are, but how they were established, and every bit as important, how we can or may comply with some of those. So we really need to get to the state or regional participation conversation very, very quickly. We also have to decide as a state what's our policy. That 11.3 million tons of mass that is our final target, if we were to include new sources, that means any combined cycle or coal plant that is ever built in the future, if we want them subject to this plan, then that 11.3 million ton allowance goes up to 11.9 million tons. Now that's a difference of roughly 600,000. Is that something that we want to consider? There are pros and cons to that, and many states are struggling with, what to do in that regard. The second to last one to me is very important, and this to a certain extent exists outside the Clean Power Plan. And this is a very difficult conversation to have, is that we kind of need to have an understanding of what some of the plans are for some of these existing units. That's going to, I understand that's a very sensitive, very difficult conversation to have, but it might be a good opportunity to figure out what that is right now before we require something unnecessarily. And then again, the early action for energy efficiency. There may be some benefits in getting additional allowances up front if there's investments in energy efficiency. So this is a very busy slide. This has been out there. This denotes some of the decision points that I won't spend a lot of time on rate versus mass. But I prefer this one because if we choose rate-based, I want more than anything to familiarize folks with terms. Emission rate credits, these are ERCs. These are basically allowances in a mass-based system, and this is how trading happens amongst rate-based plans. There's also the mass-based system, and these are things that we need to talk about and provide a lot of detail on, and I've already talked about this is where we need to figure out as a state how do those allowances get allocated. And this is an area that we've been concerned. I have no problem telling folks that we're in strident disagreement, with this concept. Is that I've already told you that this system, this rule contemplates a nationwide participation. In the final rule, in the draft rule, the target was expressed as a rate. States could choose and calculate a mass base, but it was expressed as a rate. And there was basically unfettered trading or partnering with any other state. The final rule gives us a choice between a rate or a mass-based system, but the final rule says rate can only trade with rate and mass can only trade with mass. So you're essentially going to a room that you're seeking dance partners with, and your dance partners have been already limited from the beginning. And that's an area where we continue to push, that there are ways, it's a currency exchange, there are ways for rate-based systems and mass-based systems to talk with one another. And this is an artifact of the final rule that admittedly has made it more difficult than it needs to be. essentially here the concept, just to be clear, if we were to go mass and if we were to do allowances, basically this is where an electric generating unit would need to make sure they had an allowance for every ton of CO2 that they emitted. Sounds like a very simple concept, but admittedly very consequential and very complex, in terms of developing. So I've often been asked when I talk, it's like, okay, you talk about this stuff, you talk about regional trading, and we all hear about Washington and Oregon, and so what? So we can put this on the back of the electric generating units and very simply write a plan and just say make sure you have an allowance. But what, Dave, can you do to make sure that the allowances are actually available? And this is a chart that staff put together, and I have no idea on the pricing of this stuff or the economic impacts. But if you look at the United States across the nation, roughly 15% of the allowances are in the western United States and 85% of the allowances are in the eastern United States. The eastern United States also has a large number of coal plants for a variety of reasons. They're shutting down and they have nuclear that's coming online. And so we put this out there, and I want to share that, is that, okay, if you're saying you rely on this allowance-based system, where would somebody get allowances? And that's what's highlighted in red here. And you can see exactly what Washington and Oregon were given, and I'm sure that's not lost on everybody in this room. All right, so how the plan's going to be crafted, I already touched on this a little bit. The interim committee we think is very, very important. And if folks aren't on the interim committee, we think there's lots of opportunities for participation, either through the public participation portion of that or on subgroups that will most likely be formed around certain topic areas. I want to talk a little bit about impacts here. This is a requirement for us, and we take this very, very seriously. We think we would need to do this even if we weren't required. And that we need to make sure that we gather stakeholder input from all, affected areas, vulnerable communities. We've got 8 remaining plants, and this is kind of giving you an indication of where we're going to be headed. These are the locations of all of those plants, and certainly those communities are especially important to us. We need to figure out what conversation we need to have, when we need to go to those communities, and a lot of that stuff needs to be done prior to the September submittal. We also know that there's a lot of coal mines in this state, and we recognize the potential for impacts on those coal mines, and we're very interested in hearing from those areas as well. And one of the things that makes it particularly difficult for us is if you look at the state of Montana, and if you look at what may be considered a low-income or vulnerable community, virtually the entire state, relatively speaking, could fall into that category. So really what we're looking at is a statewide effort here, and this map I've given you is highlighting some of that area where a lot of the electric generating units are, as where's the coal mines. And as we map out our strategy for communicating and visiting these communities and trying to figure out what the impacts are, that's going to be an area that's going to be of particular importance to us. So I want to close by saying that, I certainly recognize that, or we recognize a lot of impacts potentially from this. We're not able to determine exactly what the extent and the degree of those impacts are until we figure out how those affected are going to be able to comply, with this rule. And it is roughly 2.5 years that we have to work on this. It's going to go by very quickly, but we're going to most likely start the interim committee meetings probably the 3rd or 4th week of February. We've got a facilitator that hopefully will be coming on board the end of the month to help us have those conversations. And I'm very interested in hearing from folks either after this or calling me. I have contact information to give me a sense of exactly what sort of questions folks have so that we can provide a meaningful stakeholder process for everyone. So with that, Todd, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Great, and we have time for questions. So, I'll just summarize here real quick. I think you can see the urgency for what we've got going on here. I think we've seen some potential impacts to the state of Montana presented by Dr. Barkey. concerns raised by Chairman Johnson and the fact that the state of Montana, this is no longer a theoretical discussion, that the state of Montana is in the process of complying with this rule. So we are at the point to where I think the infrastructure panel was the one that said this is where the rubber meets the road. This train is leaving the station, and it's leaving the station quickly. And anybody that uses electricity in this state, any business that uses especially large amounts of electricity, is going to be severely impacted by the outcome and the implementation and the adoption of this plan. So with that, I will throw it open to questions. I'm assuming there's a fair number of questions here for any one of our panelists. Yes, Bill. We want to make sure we pass around the microphone here, so when we call on you, make sure you wait for Glenn to bring the mic around.
I have a two-part question. There were two elements that concerned me as not having been addressed, Dave, in your process about how impacts are decided, and they weren't really in Pat's, well, they were, one of them was in Pat's presentation. The first question is, where are reliability issues evaluated, and who actually is going to make determinations as to, okay, if this option is followed, what are the reliability implications? And maybe, Commissioner, you'd like to touch on that too. And the other question is, where are externality issues, such as if, as some people say, well, we can just make up the coal-fired with a combination of renewables and new backup generation or peaking generation, who decides issues such as what about land use if you need several hundred square miles of windmills to get the nameplate capacity, and who pays for the peaking generation, the 230 megawatt type plant, that kind of thing? I mean, how is that factored in the process?
I'll start. Is that on? Okay. The slide, gosh, I don't have these numbered, that the final plan, we absolutely have to consider grid reliability. It's number 8 on that plan, the final plan that's due no later than 2018. Who does that? We've had a lot of conversations with a lot of regional transmission organizations, and I'm going to be honest with you, we're air quality folks. The reliability of the electrical grid is not in our wheelhouse, and so we're going to rely on a lot of those RTOs to conduct the appropriate modeling. There was a significant amount of modeling done by RTOs in the West under the draft rule that showed grid reliability would not be impacted much, if at all. It would remain stable. However, I'd say the same thing is that you have to understand we don't have any compliance options definitively on the table now for you to model. So make sure that you disclose what you're modeling, your assumptions and everything else for the benefit of the reader so that they know that that's a very preliminary analysis. Now the externalities and the cost, and I'm not sure if that was directed at me or if other folks want to weigh in on that, but we have absolutely been challenged on that from a number of fronts, including the external cost of climate change. And factoring in all the external costs in the purpose in this air quality plan, and that's why I say I'm going back to the air quality rule, is going to be pretty difficult and will most likely not meet the needs of every person in this state. There will be folks who want us to consider costs that are going to be outside, external to, if you will, some of the plan considerations that we have to be put in play here. So our approach will be to look at the compliance options. And our approach will be, to the extent the state of Montana complies, I want to say we comply minimally. Let me tell you what that means. We are not planning to go beyond what we are needed to do. It will be the minimum compliance to provide the maximum flexibility. From that, we will look at reliability and cost considerations. They're not secondary to that, but I don't believe they can be done until we figure out what the compliance options are.
Then when we call on you, please identify yourself. Other questions?
Hi, my name's Bob Heron. I'm from Kalispell, Montana. I've been peddling insurance for 38 years, so these technical questions get a little crazy. But it seems to me that it's time for the state of Montana to play hardball. Number one, let's not comply at all. Number two, though, Let's teach Washington and Oregon a lesson. Somehow find a way to shut down Colstrip for a week or two and let Seattle and Spokane go dark. I mean, let's play hardball. This is our state. Our lives depend on this. I'm in Kalispell, and this is the most significant problem this state has had probably in most of our lifetime. We need to play hardball. If this is the #1 deal for the Montana Chamber, let's play hardball.
Does anybody want to take a crack at that?
Okay, I'm just a token economist, but I believe that contracts have force for a reason. I think all of us exist, and you don't simply abrogate contracts just to make them. I think that would be a very dangerous and unproductive step.
Dave, do you want to?
If I may, Chairman, and I'll be very quick. Bob, I think that's a great question, and I think that talks to some of the consequences of just saying no. And I can share from professional experience that we lived that. We played hardball with the regional haze provisions. And I was part of that conversation that wanted to punch EPA in the nose and say, no, we're not going to do this, and we gave it back to them. And there has not been a day that's gone by that the folks that were impacted by that, and I'm talking about the owners of Colstrip, haven't been in my office begging me to take that program back. And so I think all options are on the table, and that's why, you know, you're seeing some of the legal options pursued. And I hope we have the conversation about what that means for consequences to everybody if we do say no. That would be my only thought to share.
I can tell you that it is certainly the consensus of the Montana Commission and the thought of any number of commissioners from states that are similarly, although not as severely impacted as Montana, that there does have to be today forward-looking consideration of steps that states might take to push back further if we are not successful in the courts. What some of that will look like, I don't know, but I will tell you that Montana is not alone in their frustration with the way in which this has moved forward, and that the argument is not going to go quietly into the night. Part of the thing that frustrates us, of course, is that all of these scenarios, Bob, right now are based on what if and hypotheticals. So it's hard for us to plan strategies when we don't know exactly what it is we're trying to respond to. And we've been involved for quite some time what amounts to circular conversations where the state can't decide if it's going to go with a state implementation plan or a federal implementation plan until we know what the federal implementation plan is. And states can't discuss intelligently whether or not they want to enter into regional trading agreements if they don't know whether they're going to have a state a SIP or a FIP. And so we keep chasing the tail on this dog, and until some of those decisions are made, we don't know what further pushback is going to look like. But I can assure you that, again, Montana is not alone in their commitment to. I spend a good deal of my time in conversation with leaders in other states about how we lay some groundwork in a forward-looking manner to at least prepare to take some additional steps. But I can't tell you in detail what those are going to look like today.
Yes, Senator Ankeny.
Senator Dwayne Ankeny from Senate District 20, which is ground zero for this Colstrip. You know, I've often thought, you know, when I pass away, I hope I can go back and watch who shows up at my funeral. Well, that's what I feel like today, you know. But anyway, that being said, in answer to this gentleman's question, myself and Senator Keene from Butte was invited to a Clean Power Plan meeting in Washington, D.C. put on by NCSL, 18 states. There was only 25 people there, really good meeting. One of the people that we had the opportunity to meet was a senior partner in the law firm that's handling the lawsuit against the EPA. And Keenan and I both asked him, said, well, what if we just tell them to go to hell? He said, that is absolutely the worst thing you can do. He said, by all means, work on a plan. Show your due diligence. Get a plan, because that will not help you in the long run in this lawsuit. So that being said, you know, me being on that Clean Power Plant Council is kind of like digging my own grave, but yet if you ain't at the table, you are on the menu. So I'm going to be on there, and I'm going to be trying to figure out how to keep burning coal. I mean, you know, we got $1 billion in the trust fund. Maybe we fund a commercial clean coal plant there on the footprint of 1 and 2. But what you got to remember is this ain't about carbon. This is about doing away with coal. It's a war on coal, and it's simply that none of them are talking about clean coal technology. They're talking about doing away with coal. The legislation in Oregon, the legislation in Washington is out there because the Sierra Club has lawsuits against Puget Sound in Washington, and they have lawsuits against Portland General and Pacific Core in Oregon. They forced the closing of the plant in the coal-fired plant in Oregon, Boardman, and the one in northern Washington, Centralia. So we can talk about this, and I think that would be a good idea. But for this clean coal technology, we got the money, and don't throw a couple $1 million at it. Build a commercial plant. China's got them. China's got clean coal-fired plants. But you don't see the government involved in any of this. So I've had my little platform to stand on, but it's a war on coal. It's got nothing to, I mean, they can't be stupid enough to think that this little bit of carbon they're going to cut is going to make everybody better. If they was worried about it, everybody in Washington, D.C. just quit breathing. That would take enough carbon to take care of Colstrip. So,
thank you, Senator Ankeny. We've got time for one more question.
Could I comment on Senator
Yes,
Ankeny's,
Chairman Johnson.
Senator Ankeny, you are absolutely on target. I would simply point out that if, in fact, EPA is successful in removing coal from the portfolio, which is exactly the aim, that it ain't going to stop there. The goal is not just to eliminate coal, but rather to eliminate fossil fuels, period. And I am absolutely convinced the next target, as soon as coal is gone, will be natural gas. And it will be with the same enthusiasm that they're attacking coal, and that the goal is a totally renewable portfolio in a time frame that is simply not realistic to maintain availability and affordability and reliability.
Super, and with that, why don't we allow that to be the last word of the day? Chairman Johnson, thank you for your participation on the panel here. I hope this panel has been instructive and insightful for you. Our goal was to try and to provide a little bit of education about a major regulation that has the potential to affect each and every one of our businesses. So thank you. We will we'll get together for drinks, Amy says. At 6, is that correct? At 6 o'clock. Good.